Hi, I am Lauren Bitar and welcome to my fourth book set. My featured text for this book set is The Man Who Walked Between the Towers. This book follows the true story of Philippe Petit and how he actually walked a tightrope between the Twin Towers in 1974. The book goes on to explain that the towers are no longer there, which leads the reader to ponder what happened to the towers. I chose this book because I wanted to find some good literature about 9/11. This will be a topic that I will need to teach my students about. This book is a great way to introduce the topic in a lighter manner. My first lesson is a second grade math lesson in a unit on measurements. After reading the book, students will apply their knowledge about measurements to the book. The students will use critical thinking to brainstorm all of the different ways they could measure the distance between the two towers in the story. The students will then be split into groups and given two towers. Through collaboration, the students will have to decide how far away they want their tightrope walk to be. Once the students have decided, they must measure the distance from the first tower to the second tower. Before they use a real measuring tool, the groups will have to measure the length creatively. The groups could use pencils, pieces of papers, crayon boxes, or anything else. To communicate their findings, students will use Fodor to create a collage with pictures of the different items that they use to measure the length. The students will be sure to add the details using text boxes to share their findings. To demonstrate their learning to a wider audience, the students will be encouraged to replicate this activity at home. Here is an example of student work. My second lesson is a sixth grade history lesson. This lesson will introduce the students to a short unit on 9/11. After reading this story, students will research the main character of the book. Then the students will use Powtoon to creatively demonstrate what they learned about this man. The students will then break into groups to communicate their findings with peers. The second phase of this lesson will focus on transitioning into the unit on 9/11. The students will critically think about the last page of the book, which says that the towers are no longer there. Using critical thinking, students will create a graffiti wall of their prior knowledge that they have of what occurred on September 11th. In their groups, students will then collaborate to research on the internet to either confirm or deny what they put on their graffiti boards. Based on their findings, students will create a timeline of events before, during, and after September 11th on TimeToast to fulfill the requirements of the standards. To share their findings with a wider audience, the students will post their timelines to Twitter. Now for the other books in this set. First is The Little Chapel That Stood. I would pair this story with the last book I just talked about. The Little Chapel That Stood tells of the events that occurred during and after September 11th, 2001. This story is very powerful and it highlights and thanks the police officers, firefighters, and other emergency responders who gave their lives to help save those around them. The Bat Boy and His Violin. I really liked this book because it highlights music from different classical composers in one story. It also shows that when you use your talents, great things can happen. Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. I thought this was an awesome book because the author actually interviewed real people to write this book. All of the stories are true stories that happened to people during Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath. Henry's Freedom Box. I enjoyed this book because it was so captivating. It had me on the edge of my seat with suspense. I feared that Henry would be sold away from his family, and he was. And then I feared that his children would be sold away from him, and they were. I was a bit upset that the story didn't talk about what happened to his family after Henry made it to Philadelphia. Then I realized that this was what the whole book was about. His family was ripped away from him, and he never got to see them again. While the story is very sad, it informs students of the scary reality of our country not too long ago. Finding Winnie, the true story of the world's most famous bear. I loved this book so much that I watched the read aloud twice. I had never heard about the story behind Winnie the Pooh, and it honestly made the memories of my childhood a little brighter. While children these days may not be so familiar with Winnie the Pooh, It could spark conversation about those stories and could encourage students to take it upon themselves to look into the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. I loved this book because of the picture window that was highlighted and made bigger with every animal that the old lady swallowed. It was filled with fun visuals for the students to look at. The repetitive language is also great for younger kiddos. Oxcart Man. This book was interesting because, in a simple way, it tells the story of what a normal year would look like if you were a farmer in the 19th century. I also liked it because, through the vocabulary, it really makes you think about what the struggles and joys of life were back then. Thank you for watching my fourth book critique.